Okay, this week we are going to talk about kinship. And I don't have a ton to add. I do think the book covers quite a bit in detail. And I don't necessarily want to overwhelm everyone by adding even more to remember with my notes this week. But I do want to make a few brief points here and then give you a list of the key terms to absolutely know from this chapter. So let's talk about just some of the definitions. So descent refers to rules to identify and categorize ancestors and offspring. And that leads us to this idea of kinship, which refers to rules to categorize and interact with ancestors, offspring, and other relatives, or our kin. And this, in turn, plays a big role in creating personal identities and structuring marriage and families. And remember that culture is integrated, so don't forget those characteristics of culture. And also remember that culture can be understood as a system. Each of these parts that we've been talking about, identity, gender, marriage, kinship, descent, is profoundly shaped by the others and affects the others in turn. So you can't really understand any one in isolation, and each only makes full sense in the context of all the rest. And keep in mind that, like everything else in culture, marriage, family, and kinship are socially constructed. So when we talk about kinship, we are really talking, or kinship systems, we are really talking about a society's system of classifying and relating to relatives. And it depends in part on the descent system. It is socially constructed. It's based in part on biology, but it is largely arbitrary. And so if we think about this as the Nuyo of Oaxaca, they consider some people to have multiple mothers. And so those multiple mothers include the one who gave birth to them, so their actual biological mother, and any of the ones who nursed or breastfed them. And so they refer to all of them as mother. And then there's the European tradition in which a wet nurse was little more than a servant and certainly not a mother. So there's a variety of ways of looking at this, and they can all be vastly different. If even who counts as your mother is culturally constructed, clearly kinship is not made up simply of biological facts. So really when we're talking about kinship, we're talking about how you classify and name your relatives. Which relatives do you classify as being the same or different? In our kinship system, we call a parent's brother our uncle. But are all uncles equivalent, meaning related to you in the same way? Or is your mother's brother, your maternal uncle, different from your father's brother or your paternal uncle? What about spouses of uncles and aunts? They are also uncles and aunts, right? So are they the same or are they different? And the descent relationship between you and your uncle is clearly different from that between you and his wife, who's not biologically related to at all, but we lump them all with the same naming system. So the point really of all of this is that how we lump people as being the same relatives or different ones is arbitrary and culturally constructed. And then you have to think about, how do you interact with different relatives? Do you interact with your father the same way as you interact with his brother or your uncle? When we talk about family, we are really the meaning depends on context, but here we're going to use family to mean an economic and residential group involving ties of sex, child rearing, and kinship. And even this is a simplification, since in some societies, family members don't even live together. A man may spend years away working or at sea or at war, or men may live together in a men's house and not with their wife and kids, and so on. So there's a variety of ways to construct families as well. In most cultures, a person lives in at least two families during their life. The first is their family of orientation, and that is the family that one is raised in, and it's usually one's parents and one's siblings. Or the second family is the family of procreation, and this is the family that one forms with a spouse. And it includes one's children, although it doesn't necessarily have to these days. And when we look at these, we also talk about nuclear families, and these are parents and their children. And these include adoptees. In the US, we typically see the nuclear families as a relatively autonomous basic unit. But in other societies, the nuclear family really does not exist as a separate entity. It's always a part of a larger network of kin. Which brings us to this idea of an extended family. And it has variable meanings. Often it means family with 3 or more generations living together. Or it can mean 2 or more nuclear families living together, or a nuclear family with additional relatives living together. So there's a variety of ways to look at family, and there are a variety of family types as well. And then when we talk about descent, we're really talking about how you classify ancestors and descendants. The patrilineal descent emphasizes the male line and relatives. Now, we don't look at our descent that way, but we do that for surnames. And so in our surnames, it's traditional, although not necessarily always the case, but it is traditional for the female to take the man's last name. But in true patrilineal descent, it emphasizes completely the male line and relatives. Matrilineal descent emphasizes the female line and relatives. So you are related to your mother's kin and your father just marries in. His relatives are not as interesting or as important to you. In bilateral descent systems, this emphasizes both male and female lines, as we do in recognizing equal relatedness to both father and mother's relatives, as an aunt meaning both mother's sister and father's sister. We consider the relationship to be the same on both the father and the mother's side. And a society can use different descent systems for different purposes. So inheritance of property might be patrilineal. Inheritance of religious or clan affiliation might be matrilineal. Inheritance of surnames might be bilateral or patrilineal. And possibly all of these could really occur in one society depending on how they're used. So it's not very clear when someone says society X is patrilineal, because we have to ask patrilineal for what? Inheritance? Social rank? Family name? Matrilineal and patrilineal describe descent systems, not power relations. They say nothing about whether a society is patriarchal, meaning men have power, or matriarchal, meaning women have power. There are many societies with generally matrilineal descent for family names, property status, and so on, but strongly patriarchal distribution of power. So, for example, in the Trobriand Islands, chiefs are men, so it's a patriarchal distribution of power, but men inherit their chiefships from their mother's family, so it's matrilineal descent. The eldest male of the village's highest-ranking matrilineage is the chief. So it's not as cut and dry as it might seem. And then we can look at the kinds of descent groups. So we already looked at some of these. So a lineage really are people related by descent from a known shared ancestor. So that's where we get this idea of a patrilineage. So in a patrilineage, people are related through their fathers. So in the US, the people born with a given surname, like the Smiths, would be theoretically traceable to a known male founding ancestor. Likewise, with the matrilineage, people are related through their mothers, theoretically to a known female founding ancestor. A clan is very much like a lineage, but the founder is too far back for people to trace their known genealogies back that far. So the founder may be mythical, even an animal or other non-human. A non-human founding ancestor is a totem, so like the Eagle clan, the Lightning clan. Clan membership may also be matrilineal or patrilineal. So for example, Scottish clans, Fitzpatricks, Macaulays, they are patrilineal, so identified by last name. Theoretically, they are descended from some shared founding ancestor, but most or all can't actually trace their ancestry to a specific person. And since the early 1800s, these were also identified by a shared tartan, which is a plaid pattern in cloth. So if you were a Fitzpatrick and meet someone marrying the Fitzpatrick tartan, you immediately feel kinship with him or her. Okay, so I don't want to say much more, but I wanted to clarify some of those and give you a few more examples than the book gave you. But I do want you to recognize that kinship is of interest to anthropologists, not just for its own sake, but because in many non-Western societies, It is integral to many, many other things. So, for example, economics. Your kin may be who you trade with, who you hire or work for, or who you inherit land or access resources through. You might get your social standing through your kinship. So your kin may be who supports you in a grievance, who you keep in line, who gives you prestige or honor. Or alliances. People manipulate kinship in order to create or strengthen alliances, like kings marrying their daughters to the son of another king in order to create an alliance. Napoleon divorced a woman who he loved in order to marry a Habsburg princess and thus create a social tie that would strengthen his chances of conquest in Europe. So kinship was key to this particular conquest. And when you look at these systems of classification, so when you look at the system of classification at the bottom of this slide, I don't necessarily need you to know these for an exam. I learned all of these in my freshman year of college, and I've taught this for 20 years, and I've really never had a need to know these. But do read about them and think about how it reflects on relationships. For example, if I call my biological mother Mom, it reflects a certain relationship with her. If I call my mother and all of her sisters Mom, but I call my dad's sisters Aunt, it reflects the fact that I would have had a similar motherly relationship with my mother and all of her sisters, but I would have a different, more socially distant relationship with my dad's sisters. So when you read about these different classification systems, don't just think about terms people are using, but also think about what it tells you about a person's social network in that particular society. And if you're so inclined, draw your kinship diagram and see what it might say about your social network as well. So that's kind of kinship and descent wrapped up in a quick little lecture. These are some terms that I need you to know at a minimum. There are several other terms in the chapter that are useful to know, but at a very minimum, these are really going to get you through the exam and help you really understand this particular unit. As always, shoot me an email if you have any questions.